I'll actually just turn it over to Greg Zegas.
Awesome, thanks. Thanks for being here this afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Zegas. I'm a joint MS MBA student. I'm also graduating this quarter, so very exciting. For my project, I focused on the carbon data value chain in South Korea. And if that phrase doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine. I'm going to get into it and explain it throughout this presentation. Before I get into it, I just want to give a huge shout out to my teammates who made this research paper possible. We have Youngjun from the Stanford Center at Incheon in South Korea, and we have So-Young In, who's here in the audience from the Stanford Sustainable Finance Initiative. This project and paper would not have been possible without So-Young's leadership, and we actually submitted it to a journal last week, which is very exciting. So to set the stage, we've seen over the last 2 years a wave of commitments to decarbonize the economy through net zero targets. And these are targets to achieve net zero emissions, usually by 2030, 2040, sometimes 2050 in some cases. So many governments have made these commitments, and private companies are following in suit. Of the 2,000 largest publicly traded companies in the world, over 800 have made a net zero target like this. The problem is not all companies are equally serious about making progress towards these net zero targets. So if we take a company like Samsung, for example, which made a target like this for 2045, and I'm an investor, and I'm interested in investing in Samsung, and I want to understand the carbon context of Samsung, it's really hard for an investor to do that without understanding sort of how much progress they're making towards reaching these net zero targets and being better positioned to succeed in the new climate in the coming decades. The answer to that problem is this thing called carbon data. And it's sort of a self-explanatory term. Carbon data covers everything from direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. We had some presenters today, Eric and Abby, talk a lot about CO2 carbon accounting, and that's sort of the really difficult part of this. It can also cover things like progress towards a net zero target, data on climate risks, and it's sort of bucketed together when it's being reported with environmental, social, and governance data, or ESG data. So when I say throughout this presentation, ESG data providers or ESG data end users, I'm really kind of talking about the carbon data element. And this carbon data exists in a value chain, and value chain is just a fancy word for the market ecosystem encompassing all of the players that are generating carbon data, transacting carbon data, sending it back and forth between each other, re-engineering the carbon data, and ultimately using it. And just to spend another minute diving into what this carbon data value chain actually looks like, this may look like a messy slide, but there's only 4 steps, so bear with me. First, you have the measurement phase, and this is where companies are measuring this carbon data. Then you have the disclosure and the reporting phase, and this is where companies are sort of packaging that carbon data to adhere to whatever voluntary or mandatory carbon disclosure framework that they've chosen, and they're sending that data to somebody. And then in the third phase, you have this aggregation and validation, which is where companies like MSCI or S&P TrueCost or others, they're sort of aggregating and collecting all this carbon data, and they're usually doing something to restructure it, turn it into like a ranking in an industry, make it into an index, or add some sort of like supplemental data to make it more of like a proprietary ESG rating. And then you have someone at the end of this value chain, an end user, like an investor, actually taking that data and using it to make a decision, like an investment decision. So this is sort of like an illustrative view of what this value chain looks like throughout the world. Since this is a relatively new market that's been developing over the last few years, there's sort of a gap in the literature of what this looks like at a hyper-local level in a specific geography. And so for our paper, we wanted to do a case study. And we chose to do a case study on South Korea for a few different reasons. One being South Korea is actually one of the larger contributors to global emissions. I didn't know that when I started this project, but it's in the top 10 of all countries globally. South Korea also has a pretty progressive climate policy history, including some policies that are related to mandatory carbon disclosures. And there's a couple other reasons here that I won't spend time on, but really our research objective was to understand the structure and the function of this carbon data value chain in South Korea to understand who the players are, how they're interacting with each other, how data integrity is preserved throughout the value chain, and ultimately to make some recommendations maybe on how to improve that market, and also take some lessons for other countries that are starting to have these value chains being developed. So to do our research, we used a semi-structured interview methodology. We interviewed over 20 stakeholders across the entire value chain, from the private companies that are generating the data, to the policymakers, to the local and global ESG data providers. I learned a lot throughout this process about qualitative research from the teaching team, so thank you, Anna and Randall, for helping me through that. And to get into some of the findings, this is just the same value chain map that I showed earlier. And if I put on the right side of the slide what we see in South Korea, there's two major differences that I'll point to. And the first one sort of relates to the dominance of the public sector in the value chain in South Korea. And you can see we actually called it on the right side the state-driven carbon data value chain. So you can see in South Korea, the regulators, the public sector is not only taking this like regulatory role like it does in the sort of like illustrative market-driven carbon data value chain. It's actually taking on sort of an auditing role, and it's actually serving as the primary aggregator. So it's taking in all of the data from the companies that are both voluntarily disclosing carbon data, and also through the state's mandatory carbon disclosure regime. And it's sort of housing it in its own system. And the rest of the value chain completely depends on what the Ministry of Environment is doing in its aggregation function. The other thing I'll point out that's different in this value chain in Korea is the bottom and the top of the chain are not very well linked. You can see it's missing that arrow from the end users to the companies like you see on the left. And so that means that there's the end users are not sort of a main driver of the companies getting involved in the value chain in the first place, like demand from investors that want this data to be able to make decisions better. So to get into a few other findings about this value chain in South Korea, we pose this question, is the public sector a market accelerator or a market inhibitor? And we pose that question because there are definitely some challenges and some gaps in the market that we see. One of them being that through talking to local and global ESG data providers, we found that they had a ton of trouble accessing and using the data that was being aggregated by the Ministry of Environment. So if the Ministry of Environment can improve the accessibility and the usability of that data, even add different languages so that global users can access that data more easily, it would allow for private market activity and sort of balance out the value chain. Second, I hinted at this at the previous slide. There needs to be more incentives for private market activity in the value chain, specifically linking the end users and the companies, creating more incentives for people to use carbon data, for investors to use carbon data, and for companies to provide carbon data if on a voluntary basis, if they're not actually involved in the mandatory disclosure regime that the Ministry of Environment has set up. Finally, we saw a need to extend the market coverage. So right now it's mainly focused on the largest conglomerates in South Korea. So we saw a need to extend that to small and medium-sized enterprises, and a need for the Ministry of Environment to help with capacity building to help those smaller businesses along that process. So why does all of this matter? This matters because the end goal of a local carbon data value chain is ultimately to link to global markets, to link to the global carbon data value chain. The reason for that is it can improve the access to capital for local companies, whether you're a large conglomerate or a smaller company. And it also just gives all of us globally a better sense of how much progress we're making towards net zero goals. So just keep that in mind. The end goal is global linkages. You can think of the journey towards that end goal as having these 4 steps. There's sort of the grounding and the co-evolving phases, which are where sort of the local environment is starting to align towards sustainability, and local stakeholders are starting to help each other achieve sustainability goals. And then you have the going beyond and the going across phases. And those are sort of where it's all about preparing to, and then actually finally fully integrating with the global carbon data value chain. And what we see in South Korea is that it's kind of stuck in the co-evolving phase right now. There's some activity going on in the third phase, the going beyond phase, but it's really kind of mired down in that second co-evolving phase for some of the reasons that I mentioned on the last few slides. And the implication of this, and the thing to take away from this presentation, is that when you have the state really driving the development of the carbon data value chain, initially it can progress, quickly perhaps, but at some point the state needs to start to hand off the market. Otherwise, other players, the rest of the ecosystem and the other stakeholders will not be mature enough or have the capacity to fully link up with the rest of the global carbon value chain. And that's important because as other countries in Asia start to develop the policies related to the carbon data value chains in their own localities, they're going to face a lot of the same issues that are being faced in South Korea, and they can take lessons from what's going on in South Korea to better position themselves from the start to be able to, in the end, actually link up with that global carbon data value chain. So that's it. I'm happy to switch to Q&A.
Hi. What are the potential limitations of studies like this, or are there none?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the limitations of our study was this was a case study on a single country. And I think it's difficult to extrapolate all of the findings that we find in South Korea to other countries, even in Asia, although there may be some similarities. So we would recommend obviously doing more case studies, comparative case studies with other countries. One of the things that's really unique about South Korea is the economy is really dominated by these large conglomerates. And so the companies that are being regulated through the mandatory disclosure system in South Korea are the same ones that are actually like contributing the most to South Korea's GDP. And so there's that like inherent tension between the state and the private sector in South Korea. And so maybe it's by design that the market has sort of been like mired down in that second phase and not able to link up globally yet. So that's something to definitely explore further in other countries. Another challenge is just that like this is such a it's a new market that's being developed. And so there aren't a lot of examples of countries that have progressed across that 4-step process to actually fully globally link up with the rest of the value chain. And so it would be good to sort of revisit that in a couple of years, maybe once that is just more fully developed worldwide.
I can ask one actually, just following up on that. So I know your case study was South Korea, and so it's okay if you don't know all these, but you mentioned South Korea being at that one spot on the 4-step process. Do you have a sense of where everybody else is?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. I think that, so when we were picking the case study, we were considering doing a country in Europe, for example. There's a lot more going on in Europe, and they're probably a lot more globally linked and farther along that process. When we thought about other countries in Asia, it seemed like they're a lot more slow moving on this, whether you're looking at like Indonesia or Japan. They're sort of earlier in the process where they're trying to contend with this issue of economic shocks, where if you introduce policies where you're mandating the companies start to disclose their carbon data, you could have some unintended economic shocks. And I think that it's a slow process for countries to deal with that. And a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, I think, are still kind of in that phase. And Soyoung and I have talked about this a lot.